Frank Beard open casket funeral, a phrase that carries a weight far beyond the image it creates, because the longtime ZZ Top drummer has only just passed away, and the details of his final farewell have not been publicly confirmed. At 77, Frank Beard died on August 17, 2026, while receiving hospice care at his ranch in Richmond, Texas, surrounded by family, after health problems had recently forced him away from the band's tour. His death marked the end of a remarkable musical journey that had lasted more than 5 decades, but for fans who grew up with ZZ Top, it also felt like the closing of another chapter in rock history. And that is why questions about his funeral are already attracting attention, particularly from people wondering whether the man who spent most of his life behind one of rock's most recognizable drum kits will receive a public farewell, or whether his family will choose to keep the final goodbye completely private. As of now, there is no reliable public confirmation that Frank Beard will have an open casket funeral, and no verified photographs or official details have established what his final ceremony will look like. What is known is that his family was with him during his final moments, and that fact alone gives his passing a deeply personal dimension. Beard was never the kind of celebrity who constantly placed his private life in front of cameras. While Billy Gibbons and Dusty Hill became instantly recognizable symbols of ZZ Top, Frank often stood slightly apart from the spotlight, letting his drumming speak for him. Ironically, he was the only member of the famous trio who did not wear the enormous beard that became synonymous with the band. But behind the jokes and the unforgettable image was a musician whose steady rhythm helped create the sound that made ZZ Top legendary. Beard joined Billy Gibbons and Dusty Hill in 1969, forming the classic lineup that would remain together for more than half a century. For decades, the three musicians became almost inseparable in the public imagination, moving from Texas clubs to international stages and eventually becoming members of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Their music crossed generations, and Beard's drumming was one of the reasons the songs felt so unmistakably ZZ Top. His style was not about constantly demanding attention. Instead, it was controlled, confident, and deeply connected to the groove, creating the foundation beneath songs such as Grange, Tush, Sharp-Dressed Man, Legs, and Gimme All Your Lovin. That makes the idea of his final farewell especially emotional. Fans are not simply mourning a drummer. They are mourning one-third of a musical identity that had existed for generations, and there is another painful layer to this loss. Dusty Hill, Beard's longtime bandmate and friend, died in 2021, leaving Billy Gibbons and Beard as the remaining members of the classic trio. Now Beard is gone too, leaving Gibbons as the only surviving member of that legendary lineup. For anyone who followed ZZ Top from the beginning, the thought is difficult to absorb. The three men had spent decades on stages together, traveled together, recorded together, and built something that seemed almost permanent. Even when the music industry changed around them, ZZ Top continued. Even when trends disappeared, their sound remained. Even when one generation of listeners was replaced by another, the trio was still there. That extraordinary longevity made Beard's presence feel almost permanent. But in the final months of his life, there were signs that something had changed. Beard had experienced health issues that affected his ability to tour, and during the band's current, the big one, tour, other musicians had stepped in when he was unable to perform. The situation became increasingly concerning when ZZ Top canceled performances shortly before his death. Then came the announcement that no fan wanted to hear. Frank Beard had died. The news was delivered by the band, and Billy Gibbons paid tribute to his longtime friend and collaborator, remembering him as an exceptionally innovative drummer and a true Texan. Gibbons also emphasized how important Beard's signature rhythm had been to keeping ZZ Top at the top for so many years. Those words matter because Beard was sometimes overshadowed by the band's visual image. ZZ Top was famous for the sunglasses, the long beards, the guitars, the cars, and the larger-than-life style. But underneath all of it was a musical partnership that depended on timing. Beard supplied that timing. He was the pulse that helped Gibbons and Hill sound like one unit. When you remove that pulse from the music, you begin to understand just how significant his contribution really was. Yet Frank Beard's story did not begin with worldwide fame. Born in Texas in 1949, he started playing drums as a teenager and became involved in the Texas music scene long before ZZ Top became an international name. He crossed paths with Dusty Hill during those early years, and their friendship eventually helped lead toward the formation of the trio with Gibbons. In 1969, that lineup came together, and what began as a Texas blues rock group eventually became one of the most durable acts in music history. Their rise was not instant. It took years of performing, recording, and building an identity before ZZ Top reached the level of fame that would define their careers. But once the band found its sound, Beard's contribution became inseparable from it. The breakthrough album Tres Hombres helped establish their reputation, and the band later transformed itself into an MTV-era phenomenon without abandoning the blues and boogie foundation that had made it distinctive. Eliminator pushed ZZ Top into another level of international fame, combining their Texas sound with a highly recognizable visual style. Through all of those changes, Beard remained behind the drums. He did not need to be the loudest personality in the room because his role was already essential. That quiet consistency became one of his defining qualities. Away from the stage, he was known for keeping a lower profile than many rock stars, preferring life in Texas, family, golf, and racing cars to constant celebrity attention. He was married to Debbie Meredith and was a father of 3 children, including twin sons Rory and Nico. And that is why the funeral question should be approached carefully. When a major celebrity dies, fans naturally want to see the final moments of the story. They want photographs, ceremonies, tributes, and some visible sign that the person they admired has been properly honored. But Frank Beard's life suggests that his family may value privacy more than spectacle. His death occurred in hospice care, surrounded by people close to him, rather than on a stage or in the middle of a public event. That quiet setting may tell us something about the kind of farewell his loved ones might prefer. Although no assumptions should be treated as confirmed plans, the phrase open casket can also create a misleading expectation. Unless the family or an official representative confirms such an arrangement, there is no factual basis for saying that Beard will have an open casket service or that images from such a service will ever be released. The most respectful approach is to separate what is known from what people may simply be hopping to see. What we know is that his family was present. What we know is that he had been dealing with health problems. What we know is that the band had already adjusted its touring schedule because of his condition. And what we know is that his passing has changed ZZ Top forever. There is also something deeply symbolic about the timing. ZZ Top had already survived the loss of Dusty Hill, yet Beard and Gibbons continued the band's legacy. Beard reportedly wanted ZZ Top to continue performing, and after his death the band has indicated that it intends to honor that wish. That decision may seem surprising to some fans. How can a band continue after losing another original member? But perhaps the answer lies in what Beard believed about the music. To him, ZZ Top was never simply 3 people standing on a stage. It was a sound, a history, and a connection with audiences that had lasted for generations. Continuing the music does not erase his absence. In some ways, it makes his absence more obvious, because every beat played by another drummer will remind longtime listeners of the man who once sat behind that kit. And that may be the most emotional part of his funeral story. The final goodbye does not necessarily happen inside a church, chapel, cemetery, or funeral home. For a musician, goodbye can happen every time the opening rhythm of a familiar song begins. It can happen when an old ZZ Top record is played again. It can happen when fans see the band's logo and immediately remember the 3-man lineup that seemed impossible to break. It can happen when Billy Gibbons walks onto a stage and there is one familiar face missing from the picture. Frank Beard spent more than 55 years creating rhythms that people around the world could recognize within seconds. That is an extraordinary legacy, especially for someone who never needed to stand at the front of the stage to become unforgettable. He was the steady force behind the songs, the musician whose timing allowed everything else to move. And perhaps that is why his passing feels different from the loss of an ordinary celebrity. Beard's career was tied to continuity. ZZ Top's greatest strength was that fans could return to the same music decade after decade and still feel something familiar. His death breaks that sense of permanence. For younger listeners discovering ZZ Top today, Beard will be remembered through recordings and archival performances. For older fans, he will remain connected to memories of concerts, records, road trips, television appearances, and moments in life when a ZZ Top song happened to be playing in the background. Those memories cannot be placed inside a coffin. They cannot be buried. They remain with the people who experienced them. The details of Frank Beard's funeral may eventually become public, but the most important part of his farewell is already known. He was surrounded by family at the end of his life. Whether his family chooses a private service, a public memorial, a traditional ceremony, or something entirely different, the absence of an open casket photograph should never be interpreted as a lack of tribute. Sometimes the most meaningful farewell is the one that remains away from cameras. Sometimes a family chooses to protect the final image of someone they loved rather than share it with the world. And for a man who spent decades giving audiences his music while keeping much of his personal life private, that kind of farewell would be entirely consistent with the quieter side of his personality. There will undoubtedly be more tributes. He was there when ZZ Top was born. He was there when the band became a global phenomenon. He was there when their music moved from small Texas venues to enormous stages. He was there when the group entered the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 2004. And he remained connected to ZZ Top through the death of Dusty Hill and the band's decision to continue. Now the man who helped hold that rhythm together is gone. And as fans wait for confirmed information about his final arrangements, perhaps the image that matters most is not an open casket at all. It is Frank Beard sitting behind his drums, relaxed and focused, doing what he had done for more than half a century. No dramatic farewell could fully capture what those decades meant. No ceremony could summarize the countless hours spent creating music. No single photograph could explain why millions of people felt they knew the sound of his drumming even if they did not know the man personally. Frank Beard may have left the spotlight, but his place in rock history is already permanent. And whenever those unmistakable ZZ Top rhythms begin again, his presence will still be there, quietly, unmistakably, and forever keeping time.